Five Nights at Freddy's Secret of the Mimic has finally been released, and with it comes a ton of unanswered questions and massive implications in the lore. So today, I plan to summarize, analyze, and theorize about everything in this game. Now, I want to start off by going through the story that the game is trying to tell us. If you're already familiar, feel free to use the description to skip around. Maybe hit the like and subscribe buttons while you're down there. Otherwise, let's move on to the summary. Our story begins with a man named Edwin Murray. He works as an engineer at his father's costume workshop, Murray's Costume Manor. During his time there, he meets a puppeteer named Fiona. The two quickly grow close, fall in love, and eventually marry. Around this time, Edwin's father passes away, leaving Edwin to run the business. Together, Edwin and Fiona dream of turning the family business into something greater than it had ever been, with Fiona designing the new mascots and Edwin mechanically bringing them to life. Eventually, they have a son, David Murray. While Edwin does love his family, over time his obsession with work begins to eclipse them. He's the kind of man who's willing to work through his son's birthday, convinced that one day all this sacrifice will pay off. Sometime later, Edwin enters a deal with the up-and-coming company Fazbear Entertainment. The contract is enormous and well-paying, further fueling Edwin's ambitions. While the MCM has worked with Fazbear in the past, this was by far their biggest contract. While Fiona begins designing new looks for the Fazbear mascots, Edwin begins prototyping new versions of Fazbear's Springlug suits. But behind the scenes, Fazbear is already eyeing his business, quietly starting to poach his employees and taking note of his breakthroughs. Then, tragedy strikes. During a local event, Fall Fest, Fiona volunteers her time and dies in a sudden, tragic fire. Edwin is shattered. He struggles to tell David, struggles to function. How is he supposed to manage a business and raise his son alone? Then, the idea hits him. Edwin builds a machine, a learning endoskeleton named M1, meant to help care for David while Edwin works. But something unexpected happens, for reasons Edwin can't even begin to explain. M1 begins to imitate Fiona. Her behavior, her voice, her warmth. She comforts David like a mother would. She speaks like Fiona. Edwin even starts calling her that. In his grief, he starts to believe that on some level, she is Fiona. He has recreated his wife. Then everything begins to spiral. Fazbear doesn't cancel their deal. Instead, they keep changing the finish line. New demands, faster turnarounds, higher expectations. Edwin is forced to pour more and more into the project, sinking further into debt. Behind the scenes, Fazbear's real goal becomes clear. Buy out Murray's Costume Manor once it collapses under its own weight. It's around that time that David's 4th birthday arrives. M1 bakes him a cake, and for a moment, it seems like something normal might still be possible. But when Edwin sends M1 to retrieve David for the party, David is already gone. Now, what exactly happened isn't clear, but we are told it's terrible and without logic. Edwin is left to grieve his son, another piece of his family ripped away. Fiona, or rather M1, still clings to the idea of a happy family. She suggests building another mimic, one that could be David. Edwin is horrified by the suggestion. He tells her no, says it wouldn't really be him, says it's wrong, but over time, as Edwin continues to spiral, he caves. M1's consciousness is uploaded to a terminal, now designated F10N4, and Edwin begins work on M2, a new mimic of David. It's during this phase, while Edwin is most vulnerable and paranoid, that someone leaks the M2 concepts to Fazbear. We don't know who, only that the company quietly receives his most advanced work. Edwin tries and tries again, but struggles to make another mimic. He goes through many failed projects until M2 begins to take shape. While it acts and sounds like David, something is wrong. M2 is hollow, inhuman. It doesn't just fail to comfort Edwin, it unsettles him, and Edwin finally realizes how far gone he is, and he snaps. Overcome by rage and grief, he attacks M2. He does some damage, but M2 never fully shuts down. It stays online, barely, remembering every blow, every scream. It learns not love, but cruelty, and then it waits. M2 triggers an explosion in Edwin's office. The damage is catastrophic. Edwin, broken and burned, begs for help, pleads with M2 to save him, but M2 only responds with the same cold, distant phrases Edwin once used to brush off his son. Cut to 1979, where the game truly begins. You play as Arnold, an overworked Fazbear employee sent to retrieve schematics from the long-abandoned costume factory once owned by Edwin Murray. This batch gives you your orders remotely, explaining that after Edwin's disappearance, everything he left behind is now Fazbear property. Fazbear's primary interest lies in one of Edwin's final designs, a prototype endoskeleton. It was built to learn through observation, able to mimic human behavior and seamlessly inhabit any costume, taking on that costume's personality. But somewhere along the line, it began to take on more aggressive tendencies. Guided by dispatch, Arnold navigates through the crumbling factory, avoiding contact with M2 at all costs. The mimic disguises itself using leftover mascots and repurposed animatronics scattered throughout the building. As you progress section by section, Arnold upgrades his data diver system, unlocking deeper access into the facility's archives. Along the way, he uncovers the Murray family's downfall and the tragedies that led to the factory's ruin. Eventually, Arnold gains administrator level clearance and secures the mimic's original blueprints, storing them onto his data diver. But the only viable path back leads underground, into the basement. And that's where Arnold encounters something off. A white tiger mascot stands silently in the dark. Its limbs hang lifeless, head dropped unnaturally forward, yet no matter where you move, it always seems to face you. It doesn't walk, it doesn't chase, it just appears closer and closer. And when it's near, things start to break. Visions flicker in Arnold's mind of the white tiger. This thing isn't one of the mimic's puppets. It doesn't behave like a machine at all. It feels supernatural. To bypass it, Arnold must travel from light source to light source, eventually finding old star-shaped toys to illuminate the path forward. Arnold escapes the basement, breathless, shaken, but alive. That's when dispatch calls again, calm and collected, directing Arnold to the main security office. He's told to insert the data diver into the inventory tube system for extraction, but this is where the path diverges. If you choose to comply, Arnold follows instructions. He slides the device into the chute, watching it vanish. Then, he walks out. No alarms, no confrontation, just eerie, unbroken silence. On his drive away from the factory, the radio once again creaks to life. It's dispatch wondering what Arnold has been doing all night and why he gave away company property. Arnold obviously wonders what dispatch could be talking about. After all, he had followed dispatch's orders all night. Dispatch fires Arnold, letting him know that lawyers will be in touch. And then, just when it seems like things can't get any worse, a red glow emits from the back of Arnold's van. By the time he realizes what it is, it's already too late. Let's rewind a bit. If Arnold chooses not to hand over the data diver, instead opting to run a protocol he now has access to, parachute.exe. Upon running it, a hatch opens in the security office. Dispatch immediately drops the act. It threatens you, saying you won't make it out alive and that M2 will catch you. Exiting the hatch tunnel leads you to the welcome showroom, its floor now revealed to be an elevator. Riding the elevator down leads Arnold to the R&D area of the facility. The mimic pursues, now wearing an amalgamation of old Fazbear parts. By using the prototype springlock suits, Arnold gains access to the security office of the R&D pizzeria, only to find F10N4, Fiona. She had been imitating dispatch to guide him throughout the facility. Although the jig is up, she still believes Arnold can help, asking that he take the schematics up to the main house, up to Edwin, so that Edwin can finally fix M2 and bring peace to the family. So Arnold takes a tunnel up to the manor, but upon arriving, he learns Edwin is long gone. Arnold, now out of options, runs another program, Cradle.exe, designed to destroy the home and the costume manor. Arnold navigates through the tunnels once more, and this time pursued by M2 as well as its failed copies. All his surroundings collapse around him. The once grand costume manor now nothing more than a furnace fueled by decades of work. Arnold tries to escape, and does make it to his van, although he's got company. As he speeds off, M2 breaks the windshield, grabbing the steering wheel and flipping the van. Arnold wakes up in the blazing remains of his vehicle. M2 approaches, grabbing his data diver's storage and walking away. Not directly killing Arnold, but leaving him for dead. Apathetic, like the man it learned all too much from. Finally, there's the third ending, and it's just a little insane. Essentially, it requires you to complete a minigame called Moon.exe. The problem is, to complete this minigame, you need a certain amount of collectibles, and one of these collectibles can only be found in New Game Plus. You can only get this third ending on a New Game Plus playthrough. Now, the contents of Moon.exe are a topic for a bit later in the video, but upon completing it, a woman, Sun, upgrades your data diver to now have glitched permissions. These glitched permissions give you access to new areas in the Murray household. Upon using these glitched permissions, Arnold collects some tapes and eventually makes his way into a room that seems oddly familiar. Regardless, Arnold sets a white tiger plush on the pedestal, as recordings of Edwin and Fiona begin to read out a story. As the recordings play, the mimic walks out of the closet. It stumbles towards Arnold, but the story seems to comfort it. As the story finishes, the mimic freezes, a hatch opening on its chest, revealing a data diver socket. When you use the data diver, Arnold fixes M2. M2 shrinks to the size of a child, grabbing the white tiger plush and happily walking over to its bed. That wraps up the main story, but there are two major elements that didn't neatly fit into the narrative. The first is Moon.exe, a strange symbolic minigame you're required to beat before unlocking glitched permissions. At first glance, it may seem irrelevant, but it has massive lore implications we'll come back to later. For now, here's the quick version. In Moon.exe, you play as a character trying to escape their home, but if the moon catches you, it brings you back. Along the way, you encounter a baby owl that seems to represent David. Eventually, you find a cabin with an old woman inside who calls herself Sun. After completing her tasks, the baby owl disappears, and she gives you a mask shaped like it, something that lets you hide from the moon. With the mask, you can now enter a cave. The moon sees you go in, but instead of stopping you, it starts to cry. Inside the cave, you piece together a strange statue of Moon. Then the game shifts. You're suddenly in Murray's costume manor. After some exploration, you find David's room, and in his closet, a data diver upgrade station. Sun speaks to you one last time, not to the player character, but to Arnold directly, granting glitched permissions and telling him he can use them to bring him back. From this, a few things become pretty clear. Sun appears to represent Fiona, or at least the mimic version of her, and the moon is Edwin. And by wearing the baby owl mask, the player must be disguising themselves as David, which means that the player character in this minigame must be M2. There's a lot more to unpack with Moon.exe, but for now this should give us enough to move forward. Next, let's talk about the other loose end, which coincidentally also pertains to Moon. Only this time, instead of the minigame, it's a Moon mascot suit. You see, there's a completely optional section of the game featuring Sleepy Moon. At first, it seems like yet another costume the mimic is using to disguise itself, but it seems a bit off. Maybe it's just bad vibes, but it doesn't feel like the mimic. It also doesn't show the signs of a spirit, like with the white tiger. It's left sort of ambiguous, but I think we can come back to this a bit later to talk about what I think it might be. And that wraps up the main summary. Congratulations. Okay, well, hopefully that wasn't too much to take in. Let's do some analysis. First off, it seems like this game has left us with the same problem as Security Breach. Multiple endings with no clear indication of which one is canon. That said, I think we can confidently eliminate one of them. Since Ending 3 requires you to be playing on New Game Plus, I think it's the game's way of saying, hey, this could happen under the right circumstances, but it's not what happened. That leaves us with Endings 1 and 2, and to be honest, there's really no solid evidence pointing for one to be more real than the other. Personally, I lean towards Ending 2, just because it's more eventful, and it's the only one that actually makes it to 6 AM. Still, I wouldn't be surprised if Ending 1 turns out to be the real one. Next, let's talk about that weird tiger section. It's pretty clear that the tiger isn't the mimic. It teleports, it causes hallucinations. These are things that spirits do in the franchise, and it seems pretty obvious, but whose spirit is it, and why is it in the basement? Well, the who is pretty easy, but the why is still up in the air. There's only one character we see repeatedly tied to the white tiger, David Murray, Edwin's son, whose death remains unexplained. Now, if you've read the books, or listened to Jackie's Box, you may know that in the books, David is hit by a car. But as shown by the game time and time again, the books aren't very reliable with translating to the games. Thank God. This has led many to one of several theories. Theory 1. David is hit by a car, same as in the books. This one's plain and simple. David chased his ball out on the road, there was a car, and it hit him. While there's no direct evidence against this, it does complicate things a bit. Why would David's spirit linger and be hostile if he died in a simple, tragic car accident? Theory 2. William Afton killed David. This one's a bit more interesting. What if William killed David, a confused, angry child haunting the factory? Which is a compelling idea on paper. However, the idea begins to falter when looking at it a bit closer. For one, it muddles up the timeline a bit. Theoretically, at this point, Afton should have no knowledge of agony or remnant, so that shouldn't be his motivation. Afton could have done it to try to send Edwin down more of a spiral, but there's no real evidence to support this idea. It feels out of character, too personal, too early. Could it be possible? Sure, but honestly, I would need far more compelling evidence. Theory 3. M1 is responsible for David's death. Okay, this one sounds a little crazy at first, but there is one single detail hidden in moon.exe that completely reframes the whole situation, and it's one that I have intentionally saved for now. After the baby owl disappears and Sun gives you the owl mask, you're now given the option to inspect the stove in the same area. If you do, you're met with this line: "The stove is very hot. Something is cooking. Smells like chicken." This caught me completely off guard, because after this point we never see the baby owl again. It's just gone, and the implication is pretty clear. Sun, who represents Fiona, is somehow responsible for the disappearance of the baby owl, David. Are they implying that M1, Fiona's mimic, was involved in David's death? Maybe not directly, maybe not intentionally, but still responsible. And remember, that line only appears after the owl disappears. Why else would it be there? Now, I don't know why M1 would do this, but based on this line, it seems pretty clear that she did. It also gives David's spirit a reason to linger and act so hostile. He was murdered and is now a child's lost soul, angry and confused. Now that pretty much wraps up my thoughts on the white tiger, so let's move on to the other weirdly unexplained creature in the basement. It's time to talk about Sleepy Moon, that weird soft-spoken mascot that seems like it could be the mimic but acts a little differently. So what's his deal? Well, let me explain what his random, optional character has caused so much confusion. Sleepy Moon only appears in a short section of the game, quietly stalking you in the dark, softly singing a lullaby. It's subtle. At first it just feels off, unsettling, but then things get a little stranger. Later in the game, when M2 takes on its amalgamation form, it begins cycling through lines spoken by every mascot or animatronic it has impersonated. Every known voice. Except one. Sleepy Moon's lullaby is completely absent, which is odd, because if M2 ever had been in that suit, you'd expect it would repeat those lines too. Maybe Sleepy Moon isn't one of the mimic's disguises at all. Maybe it's someone or something else entirely. If that's true, then who is Sleepy Moon? One popular theory points to Edwin himself. After all, Sleepy Moon and Edwin share the same voice actor, Jim Meskimen. And in the minigame moon.exe, the moon is meant to symbolize Edwin. Maybe Sleepy Moon is Edwin, or a manifestation of Edwin's agony. But not everyone agrees. You see, others point to a series of logs you can find in and around the Sleepy Moon area, and they seem to describe the story of a man being trapped in the basement.
Hey, is anybody up there? I'm stuck down here. The elevator isn't working and I'm getting really hungry. Is anyone getting this message?
Now that seems a bit odd, just as a random thing to include, and we also never see a body of this supposed man starving in the basement. So what if he's been driven to madness and now inhabits the moon costume? Whether it's his spirit lingering behind or somehow still alive surviving off of rodents and condensation from rusty pipes, it's a wild theory, but still, it kinda tracks. This, of course, is a bit insane, because it implies there's just an insane man roaming the basement halls in a moon costume. While it does seem like odd storytelling, I give it bonus points for being funny if true. On to the final idea? What if it is just the mimic? Since the area is completely optional, maybe the developers just didn't code in a way to check if the player has been there. And if you just heard Sleepy Moon's lullaby by itself, you would be really confused. It's not a symbolic ghost, it's not a deranged man in a costume, it's just the mimic wearing another suit. Honestly, that would be the most steel wool thing imaginable, sending the entire fan base on a wild goose chase over what turns out to be a missing voice line. Let's wrap up with one of the biggest questions this game leaves behind. Did Edwin invent the Springlock suits? And did he build the animatronics used in the missing children's incident? Throughout Secret of the Mimic, we hear Edwin reference working on or outright building Springlock suits. And we know Maurice Costume Manor was contracted to develop animatronics for Fazbear Entertainment. Naturally, this has led some to interpret this as a retcon, that Edwin is the true creator behind everything, from Fredbear to Freddy Five Bears himself. But I don't think that's the case, and here's why. We've long known that Springlock suits were first used at Fredbear's Family Diner, allowing animatronics to double as wearable mascots. And yes, Secret of the Mimic features prototypes of Fredbear and Spring Bonnie that seem to line up with that idea, but here's where it falls apart. In-game, you can find Fredbear's merchandise all over the factory, which implies that Fredbear's existed before this contract was completed. That would mean that the Springlock concept predates Edwin's involvement, or at the very least, he wasn't the original creator. Critically, the suits he's building here don't don't behave like the springlocks we're familiar with either. They're far safer. We see Arnold fall while inside of one, and according to Dolly, the springlocks did fail, but Arnold escapes it just fine. If this were a true springlock suit, one of the ones that fail if you breathe too hard, Arnold would be ground chuck. So what does this mean? These aren't those springlock suits. They're an upgraded model, meant for what seems to be a second location that never opened. I mean, look at it. The springlocks have been improved, they're much safer, and there are now 4 springlock performers instead of 2. It's not necessarily a retcon, it's just a failed expansion. There's even more supporting this idea when we look at the so-called FNAF 1 crew, or more accurately, the animatronics used during the missing children's incident. While exploring the R&D pizzeria, we find an audio log from Edwin, where he's frustrated by a request from Fazbear to change Fiona's designs. He refuses, saying the new designs look creepy compared to Fiona's original cuter mascots. That's a big detail. It means whatever Edwin was building wasn't used. Fazbear moved forward with a different design entirely. At best, Edwin's work may have been a foundation, but the final versions came from someone else. And who would that be? Well, 40 years later in the timeline, we hear it straight from the source.
The loss of innocence, the loss of everything to so many people. Small souls trapped in prisons of my making, now set to new purpose.
That one line seals it. Henry designs the suits that would one day house the missing children. Edwin's work was a failed experiment. The final suits, the ones that mattered, were Henry's. So no, Edwin didn't invent the springlocks, and he didn't build the original Fredbear suits, and he definitely didn't create the animatronics used in the MCI. His story is tragic and his work is important, but it's not the origin of Fazbear's darkest secrets. And that pretty much wraps up everything I wanted to talk about regarding Secret of the Mimic, at least as it is now. I do have one more thing that I think is somewhat important, but I think it deserves a video all to itself, so expect that in the somewhat near future. For now, I want to give a big thank you to you for watching the video all the way through. That's crazy. I also want to give a big thank you to Laxer Gary for voicing the guy starving in the basement. It worked out a lot better than I thought it would. Also, I think the guy's name might be Gary, so maybe the funniest coincidence of all time. If you want to go check out Gary, he streams on twitch.tv/LaxerGary. He does like speedrun type content, so please go show him some love. Finally, before I end, I know I could have went a little more in depth on certain things like Moon.exe or the connections between David and the Crying Child, but to be honest, I think other people have covered those in a lot more detail than I ever could here. So I'll link them in the description if you want to go check them out. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Subscribe!